All right, hello everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started this beautiful morning. My name is Nicole Ritchie. I am a field crops educator for Southwest Michigan based out of St. Joseph County. And welcome to Virtual Breakfast this morning. We're glad to have you here. And now I'll introduce Dr. Erin Burns to talk about post-weed control options. I don't know about you all, but every season it seems like I need a little bit of a refresher. So thanks to Dr. Burns today, and we're excited to hear from her.
Awesome. Thanks, Nicole. So today we're going to be talking about post-emergence weed control. And my name is Erin Burns. I'm a weed scientist here at MSU. And for folks who didn't get to see this week's article that Nicole wrote, who is a wonderful educator out of Southwest Michigan, but she also is talented in many other ways. And she put this cartoon together, an article, and the title of the article was Weeds Outcompete Cash Crop in Surprising Victory. And our goal today of this talk is to make sure that this doesn't happen on your farm, in which the weeds, pick your favorite species, placed first, second, and third in this race, and the corn was just got a participant award, didn't even make it on the podium. And what she wrote was, when she interviewed the weeds after they won this race, it was easy to break through without any residual herbicide. We do this all the time, the winning weed bragged. And then she interviewed the poor cash crop. And the crop failed to place in this race and decided to give no comment on their subpar performance. So the goal today is to make this corn or field crop that you're growing on the first place holding that wonderful trophy. So to do that, I like to think about weed control having like two overarching goals. The first is more immediate, that's this year, is to maintain and protect crop yield. And then your long-term goal, especially with some of our more troublesome weeds, is to deplete the weed seed bank. And I'll go over that concept in a little bit. So how do we avoid yield loss? And the first part is starting clean. So I know many of us are still planting and getting out there. So I wanted to remind folks of previous virtual breakfasts that talked about this. So Dr. Christy Sprague, the other weed scientist on campus, gave a wonderful virtual breakfast on March 27th, all talking about early season weed control. So visit that if that's what you're still thinking about or have questions on. And then also Dr. Erin Hill gave a great virtual breakfast on April 24th, outlining the status of herbicide resistance and especially with water hemp. So that's a good overview of what you might be up against this year, and I'll touch on some water hemp control options in a little bit. But what I'm going to focus on today with our time is effective post-emergence passes with residual and really timing that to preserve long-term yield. So as you're sitting, wherever you are this morning with your coffee or favorite morning beverage, I want to ask you, when do you think weeds should be controlled? And I would do a lot of work in corn, so I used a corn example to prevent yield loss. Should we wait till the weeds are 2 inches tall, 4 inches tall, 6 inches tall, 9 inches tall, or a foot? So think to yourself of when you're normally thinking about putting that post pass out there. And then we'll put some data behind that. So this was a study that was conducted over a large number of Midwestern states, including Michigan, for 34 different site years, a pretty robust study in which they waited to control weeds until they were 2 inches tall, 4, 6, 9, or 12, and then the rest of the season was weed free. And what they found was that weeds were controlled when they were 2 inches tall, we preserved 100% of our yield potential. If we waited to 4 inches tall, we lost about 3% yield. If we go to 6 inches, now we're about 6%, and then 9%, you can see we drop off pretty quickly as those weeds are allowed to compete with whatever crop you're growing. This is not just agnostic to corn, it's across a wide variety of crops, see a similar path. And if we think about the average yield loss attributed to weeds in corn is about a bushel per acre per day. So think about what you're planning on maybe selling your crop this year, and you could equate a dollar amount to waiting until these weeds are too tall to preserve the yield that you're targeting. So today I'm going to highlight some of the resources we have in our weed control guide. I don't have time to go over everything, but I wanted to highlight some of these as you're looking. There's a lot of different herbicide options you can use for post-emergence in a number of our field crops, and they're all outlined in here along with some fact sheets. And at the very end, I'll give a link to our website, which you can get a PDF version of the guide, or you can still purchase one if you're looking for that. And the first way we think about controlling weeds post-emergence is looking at crop growth stage or height. And this is because often crop growth stage is influenced the tolerance of that crop to a particular herbicides depending on the growth stage. So in both the corn and soybean section, we have outlined tables that go over this that have both the weeds, which I'll touch on later, but what can be important is either the minimum or maximum height. This is for the corn section, so either in inches or collars or V stage, depending on what is on the herbicide label. And often every year I usually get a photo or two. Usually the culprit is this is a field that was sprayed with 2,4-D too late. Usually we say about the corn shouldn't be above a pop can, and this was definitely, and it was at two different stages. So this is my foot I'm circling right now. These plants are completely flat. A large number of them snapped off right at the base. And then this field is actually a bit farther along. So these leaves are all curled up. And then a common symptom we see once they bounce out of this injury is those unfurl. And because they haven't been photosynthesizing, there'll be yellow or white stripes kind of throughout the field. It looks like a kind of like a zebra. And then also we want to think about herbicides with residual activity, and I'll cover how this is becoming a more common thing to do, putting a residual herbicide with that post-emergence pass to control especially water hemp and some of our weed species that can emerge really late into the season. But one of our greatest strengths here in Michigan is our crop diversity. So at the very end of the guide, we have a rotation restriction table, and these are all in months to ensure your herbicide program this year isn't going to impact the crops to follow. And then what I really like to focus on more than crop height is weed height. And weeds, we know, compete for water, nutrients, and light. That's what they're competing against your cash crop for. And in both the corn and soybean section, we have the same tables, but with weed sizes of some of our common broadleaf and grass weeds here in the state. And these are heights that you would find on the label. So lots of times I get a call, hey, Erin, the glyphosate or Roundup label tells me I can control 20-inch common lamb's quarters. And yes, that herbicide would be effective at that height. I picked on glyphosate because it can kill some pretty tall weeds. But we know, especially by that data I shared earlier, that waiting this long is not a good idea because that yield loss has already occurred. So I just like to highlight that when you're looking at some of these labels, it's just that it could physically kill that weed, not keeping in mind any kind of yield loss. And we know that weeds have various growth rates. And often when we're out scouting, we can scout one day and they're quite small. And a couple days later, they've already reached that usually 2 to 4 inch target that we go for. And that's because they have slow initial growth during a kind of our cooler conditions. There's a lot of things the plant needs to do to produce above ground biomass to get going. We have a large number of different weeds in the state. I've just picked on horseweed or mare's tail as an example of a winter annual weed that overwinters as this rosette, this circular leaves that are kind of flush with the ground, and they hang out in this stage for a while until enough heat days have accumulated in which they bolt, and they rapidly elongate, get quite tall, and that's usually during the time frame that we see a lot of our post herbicides fail on these type of weeds. So when you're out scouting, knowing that this can happen within a number of days to plan your post pass. And then some of our aggressive pigweed species, such as water hemp or Palmer amaranth, can grow 1 to 2 inches a day. So once you see these plants about 1 inch tall, it's a good idea to make sure that you are thinking about applying that post herbicide pretty soon. And then also predicted rainfall. So Jeff will tell us what we're up against this following week and maybe for the rest of the summer. But there's a table in the guide that has all the rain-free periods from herbicide labels on there to ensure that you're applying your herbicide and it's not going to be washed off that leaf and has adequate amount of time to get into the plant. So those are some things to keep in mind for tactics of when you're trying to decide to apply your post pass. But now I want to talk a bit about the weed seed bank, and that's the weeds that are just hanging out in that soil. So that's really what you're up against long term when you're making weed management plans. And this can be from weeds that escaped control the previous year Various weed seeds have very long persistence levels in the soil. And then animals and ultimately humans, us, are great ways to move weeds into your soil seed bank. And this really serves as a knowledge of past either successes or failures of how many seeds are in that seed bank. And if we can understand what's in it, we can really help our long-term plans. And the goal of depleting the weed seed bank is really the opposite of what a financial planner would ever tell you. And that's to take as much cash out of your bank, so much seeds out of the bank, and put not much cash in. So don't put new seed inputs into the seed bank. So I picked on water hemp because that's a common weed that we're battling in the state. Water hemp can produce up to 1 million seeds per plant, and those seeds are usually viable for about 4 years. So I put a quick model together to show how rapidly the weed seed bank can expand based on different control levels. So this is 99% control across the board. So year one, you start with one water hemp plant. That produces 1 million seeds. In year two, you have 250 plants. Year three, now we're 31,000, and this is numbers in the seed bank. And then we have about 4 million water hemp plants in your soil seed bank. So rapid expansion. So for me, it's hard to picture that many seeds. And water hemp seeds are really small. So I Googled how big water hemp seeds are. They're about 0.04 inches. And I was like, well, if I lined up those seeds in Spartan Stadium, how far would they make it each year? So in year one, we're hardly making it out of the end zone. Year two, pretty similar. We've made it about a foot. Year three, now the number of seeds is about 34 yards. And then by year four, we're 42 times up and down Spartan Stadium with the number of water hemp seeds if we just lined those up. So just to try to give you a nice visual of what that would look like in your soil seed bank. I next looked into, let's say we can get 100% control in corn and only 90% control in soybean. How would that happen? So we start off with one plant. We're able to kill all those that emerged in corn. So reduces the number that we're up against the following year in soybean to about 93, similar. And then to do the percent reduction, now we've reduced that seed bank by almost about 95% if we can get that level of control in corn, which is possible. And I'll go over some strategies in a second. And then I picked on soybean again. So let's say that we had only 80% control. This can happen with some of our populations that are resistant to various herbicides. If we do the same kind of scenario, now by year four, we're at 1.6 billion. So remember when we had 99% control, we were only at about 200,000. So just to show how quickly this weed seed bank can explode. And sometimes in these early years, we don't see any implications on yield. But long term, we're going to have a problem when we get these seed banks built up so much. I'm going to touch on hemp control, and then I'll wrap up. And that's because this plant by far is the one that has rapidly exploded throughout our state these past few years. And that's because it has this extended emergence pattern. So it can outlast that pre-residual, come up after that efficacy has run out. And then if we're just putting on a post pass without any residual, we're just getting those individuals that are emerged. And if we have any kind of rain event or precipitation later in the season, that really gives new flushes of water hemp plants. They're able to emerge in that dense canopy and produce some seeds. We want timely effective post herbicides. The goal is 3 inches tall or less. And then often residual herbicides along with the post pass is a good idea. This is just a picture of water hemp and corn. If you listen to Erin Hill's virtual breakfast, you learned all about what it's resistant to in the state. But we have commonly ALS and glyphosate resistance. There are some populations resistant to atrazine. And then more alarmingly, it's the last one, populations that are also resistant to some of our PPO inhibitors. In the corn section, often what I recommend is putting together at least 2 different sites of action for post-emergence water hemp control. Group 4s, such as 2,4-D or dicamba, are highly effective, but also our HPPD inhibitors. Those are things like Armazon Impact, Callisto, Lotus. These are in a number of different also premixtures. This is a site of action that's unique to corn here in our state. So adding some diversity in our herbicide resistance management, and then also atrazine is a good idea to put in with that post pass along with these HPPDs, is it's found to actually enhance the control than what you would expect than just either one of those alone. And then I asked Christy what her strategies are for post for soybeans. So this is from her. For all soybean varieties, regardless of what trait you planted, you can apply a PPO inhibitor. There's a large number on your screen right now. If you applied any of the Liberty traded beans or Extend Flex, you can put down Liberty as another site of action post-emergence. And then our Enlist system now allows us to apply two effective sites of action. So that 2,4-D or List 1 or List Duo, and then along with Liberty. So this is diversifying the site of actions that you can put. And remember, we do have Group 14 resistance in the state. So if you didn't apply a traded bean that had either Liberty or Enlist, your options for effective post-emergence herbicides are quite few. They've also played around with putting down different group 15 herbicides. These provide that residual control. These will not control weeds that have emerged. So you need to make sure that you've put down one of those effective post herbicides. And then a few of her precautions that she usually shares with these is that it can improve late season water hemp control, especially in seasons where we get those late precipitation events, which encouraged large flushes of water hemp. It fits well with some of our early planted soybean systems, but we want to be aware of the total maximum use rates and especially crop rotation restrictions. So a number of these group 14s have 4.5 to 4 month rotations with wheat. So if you're applying that with your post pass, sometimes that can be problematic. I know that was a lot of information. This is all summarized in our weed guide in this fact sheet, and I'll also put the link in the chat pretty soon. And then my last slide is just to save the date. Our weed tour is going to be on Wednesday, June 25th this year, and we're teaming up with the Michigan Wheat Program. So our weed tour is going to be in the morning, and then their wheat field day is actually going to be in the afternoon. So this is the sign up link for that. You can attend one or both tours, just wheat or just wheat, whatever you desire, or both. So we're pretty excited to have these both on campus this upcoming year. And with that, I will give it to Jeff and answer questions in a little bit. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Erin. There are lots of questions in the chat. Some of them have been answered already, but I will go ahead and just touch on those for anyone who's only listening online. So one of the questions was, what is the longevity of water hemp in the soil seed bank? And Erin answered that it is about 4 years. After that, viability drops off considerably. And then what is eating the weeds in the weed seeds in the weed bank? That could be any number of things, specifically ground beetles or carabid beetles were mentioned, and crickets, birds, and a couple of other things that are out there. And in relation to that, a question of how can we encourage populations of these seed predators without harming our cash crop, and things like increasing plant cover, reducing soil disturbance or tillage can help that with that a lot. Let's see. Make sure you're dropping your questions in the chat and I will get to those.
I guess
Okay.
Phil asked a question about the ratings in the weed control
Yeah,
guide.
thanks.
So E is excellent. That's 90% control or above. A G is good, so 80% control or above. And is it realistic to get 99% control of a weed like water hemp? And yes. So I know it might sound crazy, especially for maybe folks who haven't had it before. But in corn, you have a lot of great options. Soybeans usually where it can be a little bit more troublesome. But Christy has done a ton of work to put together those fact sheets overlying those programs. And the key is starting with a full labeled rate of a residual product, getting timely rainfall to make sure that does its job, and then timing your at the right weed stage. So yeah, you can do it.
Here's a team question for Erin and Cristofonso. How many beetles would it take to consume seeds from one water hemp plant?
Chris, are you still on?
Yes, I did the calculation and now I got to go back and find it in the
I'm
thing.
trying to find it
So
too,
the
but thank you. I was
Google-
trying
the
to
Google
Googling it.
said that an average beetle could eat 8 seeds a day, which doesn't seem like very much, but the beetles aren't very big. And I invented that they might live for 2 months. Maybe it's a little bit longer. So that's 500 seeds in their lifetime. And Erin, I'm guess water hemp can have 250,000 up to 1 million seeds a plant. So when you divide that out, you would need 500 to 2,000 beetles per plant in order to consume all of Erin's seeds. So clearly my beetles cannot keep up with Erin's weeds.
When I found a stat that said female crickets, so they're obviously much larger, can eat 225 redroot pigweed seeds, so similar species, in 24 hours. So obviously, when we talk about weed seed predators, they're just one part. But if you can enhance those over time, I mean, they do incremental bits of their job. So by
Yeah,
no
they're
means
doing
are they like,
background.
yes, yeah.
So that background may reduce numbers by, I don't know, making up 50%, and that's just 50% fewer weeds out there to be resistant or to
Yep.
select later in a spray or whatever. So yeah.
Thank you. Here's another question for Erin. With the rainy week ahead, how many hours do our herbicides need to be on the weed to get a good burn down?
So this really depends on the herbicide. There are a large number that are 1 hour. There are a large number that are 4 hours, and then some that are above. So something like Roundup or most of our glyphosate products are 4 hours. 2,4-D is 4 hours. I'm trying to look up what the paraquat label has. So Gramoxone's 2 hours. So usually that range is what's on that.
All right, thank you. And another question for you. Is there a fall herbicide program that is better to lessen pressure of water hemp the following spring?
Oof. Um, I guess it would really depend on what system you are, if you're tilling or not. Because obviously, I mean, so fall prep would get any ones that are emerged, but they're not going to have that many growing degree days emerging that late in the fall to produce any kind of seeds. So I guess I wouldn't so much focus on fall emergence, especially when they're small. They're not going to have enough time to produce seed. It's more timely in the spring with those residual herbicides. So not off the top of my head.
And then another one for you, Erin, and then I think we've got one for Jeff. In the great study that you provided over 34 site years regarding weed heights, how did these researchers keep the weeds out of the research plots without any later weeds?
It just kept spraying. So that's a great question. So I think it was just Roundup. So they just made sure, and when I've done this before too, I've just gone out sometimes weekly, every 2 weeks, with another herbicide pass to make sure that it's clean. So that's just a nice study to isolate that if you just had that weed competition from, whatever that early stage is, sometimes it's just up to like V2, V3 corn, you can have some long-lasting impacts.
Great, thanks, Erin. All right, a question for you, Jeff. Are we 100% out of any concerns for frost going forward?
The short answer is no. It's unlikely, but I think it's still possible, especially across northern sections of the state and those areas, of course, away from the Great Lakes, interior northern, lower, and interior upper. We have the threat of frost well through the remainder of May, even into early June. There, at least chronologically. Now, that said, the upper air pattern that we have, even though it does suggest cooler than normal here coming up towards the Memorial Day weekend, it's probably not one that's typically associated with frost or spring frost risk. So yes, it's still possible. We actually might see some frost here, in some parts of the state here, early next week, Sunday night, Monday. It'll be patchy though, and again, it's not a classic upper air situation where we would expect really cold, dry air. Right now, if you want to get a freezing temperature, if you wanted that, you need to have cold, dry Canadian air. And so any way that we can get an air mass here will increase those risks. But that's not probably what we're going to see. So we're still not out of the woods yet, but I think the odds are fairly low for most areas of seeing, at least certainly seeing a killing freeze or a hard freeze. That would be true.
Thanks, Jeff. All right, another question for Erin. Do pre-emergence herbicides affect the seeds in the seed bank, or do they only work on the seeds actually attempting to grow?
Yeah, that's a great question. Usually those that are only attempting to grow, so those those weeds, depending on the herbicide's in the soil water, the weed germinates, and if it's a shoot inhibitor, inhibits the shoots, roots, it hits the roots. So it's only those that are actually attempting to emerge. So not the ones that are still going to be viable for the following year.
Thanks.
Hey, Nicole, just a quick announcement about our UP credits. Today's session is one of those sessions that actually you can select a 1B category credit. So just an FYI to folks who are going to be applying for credits today. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Very good to know. Here's a comment about frost. Last week burned somebody's alfalfa in Oceana, and it looks like someone sprayed it. So watch out for that frost.
Yeah, and again, in some parts as early as even this weekend, early next week, and in some northern parts of the state, we might see it isn't again not a hard freeze, but there might be some frost there.
All right, we've got a couple of other specialists on. Chris, I think I saw Marty was on. Anything that you'd like to add? Anything that's coming up this past week?
This is Chris here. So I didn't make a little list, but I've got a few calls about alfalfa weevil, and I have seen alfalfa weevil that I thought in a few days would be over threshold. I mean, they're with high numbers, but in the fields that I saw, the worst damage was along the tree line or the woodlot, which makes sense because that's where they're overwintering. So if you do have a field like that, you might walk straight into it and then decide I'm going to spray the third that's closest to the tree line with one tank full, and then leave the rest with a little bit of weevil in it so you keep your good insects that we talked about earlier, because there's a lot of parasitoids that would attack. Phil said he's only seen parasitized weevil, I think, earlier. So, you don't want to keep spraying. What else? Looking at the degree days that Jeff showed, we'd be close to corn borers starting to pupate in southern Michigan. Most of you don't have to deal with corn borer because of your BT corn, but some of you are trying some non-BT corn. So you're going to have to think about, you're going to have to walk corn early in order to look for that damage if you're going to deal with it. What else? And a call or two about black cutworm, and just kind of like dribs and drabs, I should say. Nothing, no seed corn maggot calls yet. So that's unlike last year. That's about it.
That's good. Are the slugs up and about, do you think?
There are slugs up and about. They were up and about quite early. So there's aphids in wheat, again, a little earlier than normal, unless maybe people are actually checking their wheat a little earlier, which is good. But I think people are thinking about stuff and nothing over threshold yet.
Thanks, Chris. Any other
I
specialists wanting to weigh in?
I can just add a comment about the alfalfa weevils. I haven't seen a lot of them around here, but I am hearing reports from around locally in the southern half of the state that alfalfa harvest may start as early as next week. So remember that one of our recommended control mechanisms for weevil is just to cut a little bit early. If you can cut it early and not spray, that's going to help control your problem over spray, because if you spray it, you're going to have to wait for the pesticide withdrawal before you can cut.
Great. Thank you, Kim. All right, Dennis, you've got your hand up. What would you like to share?
Yeah, we had a wheat scouting class yesterday that we had several extension folks on, and we walked some wheat, and Christine Charles actually found the first stripe rust that I've seen all season. So that'll be something we're going to want to be paying attention to and keep scouting for. I'm also hearing leaf rust in the south, in the southern states, is really blowing up. So we'll want to keep an eye on that as well. Most of the wheat in southern Michigan is that flag leaf or even pushing the boot stage. And we're beyond week 6 in most of the rest of the state at this point. So we're at the point where we kind of need to keep track of the diseases and whatnot, and scout. And if we got to make applications, we need to, confirm diagnosis of what it is, and then make decisions using proper IPM techniques. So
Great. Thank you, Dennis. Yeah, Lyndon.
Yeah, just Jeff said something there about wheat and forages and irrigation. There's some acres out there that we go to vegetable crops as a second crop, and we raise grains ahead of them, often taken for forage. Some of those forage fields are coming off now. we've had 3 weeks that in many areas we didn't meet the water need of those crops. So we've dried the ground out. And some people will go as late as another couple weeks before taking those forages. We could get greater yields if we would think about irrigating. This week, it's going to take about an inch and a half of water. And even though we've had some wet days, we haven't got close to an inch yet in right here along the state line. So I know it's hard to think about irrigating this early, but if you have forages or small grains and you have them under irrigation, make use of that investment.
Great. Thank you, Lyndon. All right. Well, I do not see any other questions. So I think we will just wrap up. Thank you all for coming to the virtual breakfast today. Thank you to our presenters and specialists who weighed in. It's really great to hear these timely comments and get an idea of what is happening in the field. So thank you all, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Thursday and have a good weekend.